We've been talking about stakeholder strategy. And while we've spent some good time focusing on an organization's key primary stakeholders, I want to focus now on what we would describe as an organization's secondary stakeholders. And let me begin by illustrating with an example. So you may have heard of the company Uber. This is one of these new economy, sharing economy startups. Through the use of technology, it essentially allows non-professional drivers to essentially act as a taxi service for you and me. And it's driven by an app on a smartphone, and you can look and see if there's a driver in your area. You can call them, and the transaction all takes place electronically. So Uber's experienced phenomenal growth. They're one of these new high-tech, new economy startups that's grown quite rapidly. But in the course of their expansion, they've experienced some challenges. So there have been some municipalities, some cities who have blocked Uber from being able to come in and operate in that city. There are concerns about, is it always safe? Are the drivers well trained, etc. So there are some sort of government or regulatory institutions that have raised questions about Uber, and in some cities they simply haven't been allowed to operate yet. In addition, there's some sort of objections being raised in certain cities by the entrenched, already pre-existing taxi drivers, and they may be unionized, and so there may be the unions that organize the labor for those professional drivers for taxis and limo services that have a problem with Uber coming in because Uber's able to sort of price lower or more effectively and steal some customers from those existing taxi companies. So the point is, here's an example of a company who has experienced that, they've formulated a strategy, they're executing on their strategy, but they're running into some problems, not from so much their customers, etc., but they're running into challenges that arise from these secondary stakeholders. So that's what I want to talk about is the way that secondary stakeholders can bring to bear sort of institutional pressures on a business organization. These various stakeholders, oftentimes they're secondary ones, can bring pressure to bear on a firm, and that can dramatically influence the strategy and performance of a firm. So therefore, under the umbrella of kind of stakeholder management, there's a couple of key questions that you need to ask. First of all, can we predict when these secondary stakeholders might take action against us? And when and under what conditions might these actions or protests or influence, when might that be effective? And how can and should we as a business organization adopt a certain strategic approach, or how can we adapt to these strategies, these threats, these opportunities that are coming in from these secondary stakeholders? First of all, it's worth understanding that institutionalized pressure like that typically emanates from active, oftentimes organized groups of stakeholders. It could be advocacy groups or unions or governments or non-governmental organizations. And the reason why you can't ignore this is that these secondary stakeholders can really have a dramatic influence on the competitive environment. Just ask Uber. I recently returned from a trip to Vancouver, Canada, and at least at this point, Uber hasn't been allowed to operate there, and so it dramatically impacts their strategic choices as a business organization. And these pressures can pose significant threats and opportunities for firms. Now, this kind of pressure can come from the media, sort of surrounding any sort of negative press coverage. So, this can be the media highlighting unintended use of a business organization's products, or corporate misconduct, or some sort of social or religious issue, or an environmental issue. There's a long list of things that can be considered controversial, and as the media highlights those things, all of a sudden that can apply pressure to the firm to change its strategy or respond in some way. Similarly, governments can have a big influence. This is, through legislation or regulators. This can involve trade policy and tariffs. It can involve environmental policy, fees and permits and standards, that sort of thing. It can involve tax policy or antitrust statutes. So, governmental or regulatory actors are kind of secondary stakeholders, but they can have a big influence on the strategy and sort of the operational outcomes for a firm. Similarly, non-governmental organizations can have an impact. This can be sort of regulatory activism, like the Sierra Club bringing action on environmental issues. It could be labor strikes coming from labor unions. It could be, any kind of protest or boycott coming from some sort of grassroots or NGO or kind of activist organization. And look, sometimes that institutional pressure, that negative pressure on a firm, a business firm, and its strategy can be unfair. I mean, oftentimes it could be simply, large organizations get targeted for all sorts of things. So there are certainly situations in which that institutional pressure from secondary stakeholders might be thought of as unfair, unreasonable, and it's just a targeting activity. But the important thing for you to keep in mind is that oftentimes this kind of institutionalized pressure from secondary stakeholders could also be a signal of a larger stakeholder management issue that's real. And so that's the thing that you need to worry about. In other words, political actors might have some sort of self-interested motive to act against a business organization. But it also might be a signal of some deeper underlying problem. Stakeholders may act or call for action from a firm in response to either some type of normative conflict. This is a conflict with the norms or the beliefs or the purpose or the mission of a firm. Or stakeholders might act in response to some sort of distributional conflict. This arises from some type of market failure. It could be, abuse of market power. It could be, a number of other things that the firm is doing, taking advantage of information asymmetries, etc. So these are the kinds of things that if this is the source of the secondary stakeholder action that you're experiencing as a business organization, that may be a signal that we need to rethink how we're managing those different stakeholder interests.